Here's a really quick run-through of my thoughts on giving a leader of the opposition speech. When I say my thoughts, I really mean thoughts that I've stolen from people like Colin Etnier or other people that have given me advice over the years that sort of collected a little bit. So the advice falls into two categories. One is your strategy and kind of approach and presentation of the LO speech. The other one is the actual arguments that go inside the speech. So to kind of skim over the important topics from each of these, in terms of your presentation and approach, if there's only one word you can take away from this video, let that word be swag. So when you come up for your speech, you should be ready and completely convinced, at least in your mind for that moment, that your side is the only possible obvious choice, the only thing that makes sense, the only thing that's better for the world or whatever group you happen to be talking about at the time. And the way that you can help to convince yourself of that is by putting yourself in the shoes of the person who fundamentally, completely believes your side of the debate. So no matter what side of any debate you happen to be having, I can pretty much guarantee you that there's someone, real person that's probably moderately intelligent in the world that shares your view of that completely. That's like a single issue voter, single issue activist. This is the only thing they care about. Try putting yourself in their shoes, especially if it's a topic that you have trouble with or that you disagree with. Because that person probably has reasons that maybe you disagree with them because you think their reasons aren't 100% correct, or because they value something a lot and you don't value that thing very much. But just try to have some idea of what that person might say if you were in an argument with them, and why that person believes that thing, whether it's like gun rights or whatever else. Think about the person who cares about that most and put yourself in their shoes. Then try to do your best job you can of representing that person honestly in the debate. In terms of that person, if they were able to come to the debate, they would probably have a lot to say. And it's your responsibility, I think, as a debater, to give the best sort of representation of that side as you can to have the best debate. And obviously, hopefully that leads to good results for you as well. So try to put yourself in the shoes of that person, try to sell yourself on it wholesale, and come up with at least a few things that you really think are fundamentally better about that side, or at least someone could think of them as better. And one way to think of that is to try to view the round in fast forward. So a really good debater once told a friend of mine, lots of degrees of separation there, that by the time that the motion was read, as soon as they heard case statement, they could tell you what the prime minister was going to argue. They could tell you what the leader of the opposition was going to say in response, what the MG would say, what the MO would say, and then how things would be crystallized in rebuttals. And then at that point, once you're there, you can basically start playing chess with the round and figuring out what arguments are the most important, how can you weigh them and make them seem the most important really, really early on. That's a sense and a skill that comes the more you debate and the more you see the same arguments, but it's definitely something to keep in mind and keep track of, okay, am I getting closer to that? Am I at least trying to predict what happens later? And one way to sum this up, sort of, was through a problem that I had early on when I was LOing, where I would have a really good idea of why we should win by the very end of the round. By the end of my leader of the opposition rebuttal speech, I'd be like, oh, finally, okay, this makes sense. This is what I was supposed to be arguing the whole time. And the advice that I got was that if I could make the last line of my LOR the first line of my first speech, of my LOC, I would win 50% more rounds. And I think that's definitely true. Because it helps not only the judge to see, okay, this is what these people believe, but it also helps you to sort of guide yourself in terms of, okay, this is the most important thing in the round. Am I proving it sufficiently? Am I giving enough? Am I showing the impacts of this thoroughly enough? Am I relating this issue to the other ones in the round to show that it's more important? All that stuff comes together much more easily once you're able to think about that. So that's really like the very speed version of how you approach and deliver the speech. Deliver it with swag. Try to make sure your last line of your LOR becomes the first line of your LOC, so that you're coming in with a clear principled defense, or like a clear articulation of why your side is the obvious right answer in the debate. And come in with that mentality, and it'll make your life so much easier. So secondly, on arguments, This is probably the most important thing in debate, but the answer is complicated, but the simple answer is, in order to think about what arguments you want to make, one easy way to do it as an LO, especially if you have trouble coming up with lots of arguments, is to really think concretely about who is affected by this policy. So the example I heard once was, let's say it's a debate about whether or not the UN, let's say the UN, should go intervene in Syria, right? Think about the stakeholders, all the different stakeholders. Even try to, as a debater, write those out if you're having trouble with arguments. Write out all the different stakeholders you can. And then each one of those can be an independent point in your LO speech. So one of them is obviously like the UN, right? And then the important, most contributing nations to the UN in terms of troops and stuff. You'd want to think about how the US and others are affected by this. You'd want to think about Syria as a country, it's probably relevant. And the different stakeholders in Syria. So obviously you've got like Assad and the Syrian government, you've got the rebel groups, you've got ISIS, you've got the Kurds, you've got Turkey, you've got basically everybody in the region. And then you've also got Russia and plenty of other people. And you've got, even within those groups, you can break it down further. So let's say you're within the rebels, and then you want to talk about rebels who are Sunni, rebels who are, maybe they're not necessarily actively fighting as rebels, but they happen to be against the government, or their family is against the government. So they're like perhaps the children or the spouses of the people fighting against ISIS or fighting against the government or whoever it might be. And then you can make independent points about all of them. So, for example, if you were on the government side of this motion, saying that the UN should intervene, in terms of the UN's interest, you could make an argument about why the UN is the only actor that could feasibly intervene, make an argument about how they have a moral obligation to do this, all that sort of stuff, and how it could have good impacts on them as a global leader to be able to actually show leadership, and hopefully unifying leadership, on this issue. Then you could talk about how in terms of like make ISIS an independent point, and talk about why ISIS is, if you could support ISIS if you want to, but more likely why ISIS is like pretty shitty, and why you're better able to combat ISIS in a world in which the UN is involved. And so getting rid of ISIS is an independent point. Having the UN provide better global leadership is an independent point. Maybe for the US, it would be not like crazily sending in lots and lots of ground troops on its own, right, is an independent point. So you benefit people in the US. Then you benefit the rebels in Syria if you're choosing to support them. Maybe you even support many members of the Syrian government if you're able to broker this conflict well and make sure that they're not prosecuted or like savagely killed or whatever after this conflict sort of boils over. You could talk about how this would be good for the Kurds because they might get their own state. You could talk about all of these things can be independent points. They're not necessarily the best, and the ones I've said aren't necessarily the most strategic, but right off the bat you've got like 8 independent points that you could possibly have. Because each one of those, you just talk about that person, that actor, and why their life or their role or whatever gets better in a world in which you fulfill this motion. So think about all the different actors that are involved and then make independent points about them. More generally, especially if you're interested in economics, one way to think about this is to think about, or this is really anyone, think about the variables that matter in this debate, the variables that you want to maximize. So, for example, in social issues debate, the variables you might want to maximize are freedom or like happiness of certain groups of people, or justice, or whatever it is that you think is important, or like minimize unemployment. The different things that you value, you can make arguments about how all of them will get better in a world in which your side of the debate wins. So those are a couple of ways to think about who is involved. In terms of more generally, one way I've heard the LO arguments described could be, you could talk about first what is anyway, so you could talk about why this is why their position, whatever they're suggesting, is going to have like immediately terrible impacts, like terrible short-term impacts. Then you could talk about the terrible long-term impacts. Then you could talk about how there are other alternatives that could be better. And that gets really fuzzy, especially the alternatives part. But in general, it's a pretty functional argument. Or you could talk about generally how, so I talked about shaping the argument as short-term, long-term. You could also shape different arguments as like a micro argument and a macro argument. There's plenty of different ways to think about and try to break down what are the different things that are important here. But doing that can help you have a whole like diversity of arguments that you can choose from, and then try to select obviously the ones which will be the most impactful in the round, and also which are the most true, you think, that you could defend the most easily, and then weigh them really well. And so weighing is also important for LO speeches. It's hard to do in general, but it's one of the most important things you can do in debate. Start doing that at the beginning of your LO also. So after you've said, like, whatever this thing is that's so important that you think will win you the round as your first sentence of your LOC, you can then talk about how the round should be weighed. So if you're debating about environmental regulations, and for some reason this debate turns into one side says that there will be like calamitous economic decline if you have environmental regulations, and the other side says that the world will burn if you don't put these regulations on, then you can say at the beginning of your LOC, you can say, like very near the beginning, you can say you should always consider the long-term impacts in this debate, because they're much more important, and there's many more generations that will be affected by those long-term impacts than by a potentially short-term economic decline. So you can put those weighing mechanisms in early so that your MO can get up and defend them, and you can warrant them really well, and then you can use them in rebuttal. Because it's a lot harder when you try to throw in all that stuff at the end. It's a lot better and a lot cleaner if you bring up the most important material and how the judge should consider it very early in the round. So that's the really quick version of this. So make sure you approach the round with a lot of swag. Make sure you put the last sentence of your LOR as the first sentence of your LOC. And make sure when you're thinking of arguments that you haven't missed an important actor in the debate, that you haven't forgotten about some group that is massively affected, that you could have made arguments about. So those are my thoughts and other people's thoughts.